From Washington, D.C., the swamp itself, this is the week's worst with Allen and Vadum.
I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen, Vice President and Chief Investigative Officer of the Capital Research Center.
And I'm Matthew Vadum, Senior Vice President of Capital Research Center and Editor-in-Chief of BombThrowers.com.
And I'm Jake Klein, our media producer, and I'll be moderating this podcast in which we go through the news for stories that we think are the most outrageous, the most ridiculous, the worst. And we're going to be changing up our style a little bit this week. We're going, as you'll see, we now have a moderator that we'll hope to have each and every week, and that will change from myself to other people. But we're going to be focusing on one story a week now. And we're going to try to explain to you the conservative perspective on that story. So, as I'm sure you all know, there was a big tweet from Donald Trump this week accusing Barack Obama of wiretapping him at Trump Tower. This is exactly what he said. Terrible. Just found out that Obama had my wires tapped in Trump Tower just before the victory. Nothing found. This is McCarthyism. So, guys, if this is true, why didn't he release any evidence? This is what all the headlines are saying. He said this, provided no evidence at all.
Well, the evidence is already out there in the public record. We have seen that the media has been reporting about this kind of thing for months now, including the New York Times. Robbie Mook was on Fox and Friends this week, and he confirmed that there was wiretapping going on at Trump Tower. Robbie Mook was Hillary Clinton's campaign manager in 2016, and on this kind of thing, I think he's a credible witness. His spin on it was, of course, there was wiretapping at the Trump Tower. The real issue is why were Trump and his people talking to so many Russians? That was his angle.
Yeah, the media took it both ways, which is, and this is, for example, a Wired magazine story that said that, if there was, if there wasn't wiretapping, then Trump is a liar. If there was, then the question is, why was there? Because there must be something nefarious going on in order for that to be true. So Trump loses either way was the point of the story.
Right. Heads I win, tails you lose.
And it's so funny to see the media suddenly deciding to grade presidential statements based on whether they're baseless or not. Baseless was the term of the day. They always pick something like gravitas or whatever. There's a word that circulates through left-wing circles and always ends up in headlines of news stories on a given week. And this week it was baseless. And they used baseless even though there had been reports of this investigation into what was going on at Trump Tower, and more specifically with the server associated with Trump Tower. So physically, it may not have been Trump Tower, but it was connected to Trump Tower. And these stories appeared in McClatchy News, and the BBC had a story, and of course the New York Times, which said Trump's statement was baseless, even though the New York Times had reported several times on this story. In fact, the public editor of the New York Times had referred to the New York Times stories on this topic.
It was
previously.
Pretty hilarious when the New York Times ran that front page story a few days ago, talking about the baselessness of the claim, when, as you say, they'd reported it themselves just a little bit before that.
And it may be that they'll often do this, they'll focus in on some literal point, meaning, comma was not in the right place. That is to say that maybe it wasn't Trump Tower, maybe it was the server connected to Trump Tower. That's the kind of thing they'll focus on so that they can say that the president was lying. Of course, they never applied that standard to any other politician, or certainly any politician that they agree with. To a Barack Obama, for example, they always give him the benefit of the doubt, and it's kind of silly because if you're talking about comments that can be taken either way, what they do is they automatically assume that it's the interpretation that would be most beneficial to their side and most negative toward the president.
Very interesting. So it does seem, though, that this information didn't come from inside the administration. I mean, what the stories are saying is that, these are, quote, conspiracy theories that he read coming from Breitbart and Mark Levin.
Well, it's not a conspiracy if they really are out to get you.
Or it can be a conspiracy. As I've pointed out before, the Lincoln assassination was, in fact, a conspiracy. There have been many conspiracies throughout history. The question is it a real conspiracy or not? And you ask why they wouldn't release the background information. There are a number of reasons. One is you've got to be very careful what specific information you release. You can find out something from, say, spying on some Russian official or some official of some other government, and you can refer to this obliquely, but if you give away how you know this, you might be giving up sources and methods, perhaps someone who was in the room who was spying for us.
You could get operatives in the field killed.
Yes, exactly. So there are reasons for that. There are also, it's Donald Trump's strategy, in fact, to sometimes lure the media into a situation where they debunk him and then he turns out to be correct. Sometimes this happens accidentally because they're so quick to jump on him and accuse him of being wrong, as happened recently when he talked about the violence occurring in Sweden, where there have been many immigrants. I think it's the equivalent of a couple of million people by the U.S. population standards in recent years who've immigrated to the country and have from particularly hot spots that are frequently the areas where Muslim terrorism or Islamofascist terrorism will come from.
They've had particular problems in Stockholm and Malmo.
Yeah, exactly. And this is known to the people in Sweden. There was a special report on this. There was a documentary done. The documentarian appeared on the Tucker Carlson show. And when President Trump referred to that as having been something from, I think he said last night, he was referring to the report, not to necessarily to the event. But of course, within 2 days, actually, there was actual violence in Sweden related to this. So he turned out to be right. But the media all jumped on it, and in fact, I've just in the last week heard more references to how he was wrong about Sweden when in fact he turned out to be right. So sometimes you see this with the president, where he'll say one of these things, and then over time it discredits the media because they jump on it. They say he's wrong when in fact he's not wrong.
And I think that's just so important just to think about is when we're just reading the media, you hear all of these slanted perspectives on things. And just if you hear something called a conspiracy theory, I think nowadays, it might end up being a conspiracy theory, but at least go and read it first and, see what was actually there rather than just dismissing it out of hand because the New York Times or CNN, happened to say so.
Well, this is the New York Times that has a record of being off track, reporting things that didn't happen, or not reporting things that did happen.
Like in 2008 when they made up the story about John McCain, then the presidential candidate for the Republican Party, having a mistress on his staff.
Exactly.
Totally false.
Exactly. And they also went after John McCain on whether he was eligible to be president based on his birth certificate. That was the beginning of the discussion of that issue. And of course, no one mentions that it started with the New York Times attacking John McCain. Or you could go back in history where in the 1930s, the Moscow correspondent for the New York Times covered up the murder of millions of Ukrainians.
You're talking about Walter Duranty.
Yeah, and won a Pulitzer Prize for his work because what would happen is the Soviet government would feed him information so he could get front page stories in return for him covering up the parts that they didn't want published. And then, of course, there was
as millions of Ukrainians and what their Holocaust, they call it the Holodomor, starved to death. He wrote articles for the New York Times talking about how the local markets were overflowing with food and that there was no famine in Ukraine. And basically, he was, a Soviet propagandist pretending to be an objective American reporter.
And then during World War II, the New York Times sat on stories about the Holocaust or buried them deep in the paper. The explanation that's given is that, well, they didn't want the effort in World War II to be seen as a Jewish thing because there were a lot of Jews who worked at the New York Times or owned the New York Times. And so, and that was their explanation, but nevertheless, they did it. And then, of course, you have when Castro rose to power, and the New York Times was covering up his communist connections. There's an old ad campaign in the New York Times where people would say, I got a job through the New York Times, through the want ads and so forth. And so they'd have ads that said, I got my job through the New York Times. And a famous parody of that was a picture of Castro with the caption, I got my job through the New York Times, making fun of the fact that the New York Times had covered up his communist connections long enough for him to rise to power with the support of many Americans. And Kitty Genovese in 1964, remember the woman who was murdered with 38 witnesses looking down from the apartment windows and nobody did anything? That never happened either. So a lot of things in the New York Times just never happened.
Yeah, and I think this is a broad topic that we're going to end up coming back to week after week, is just what can you trust in the media? And, obviously from your knowledge on this, we all read the New York Times. I'm not saying don't read it, but at least read it in context. Try to read something critical along with it. Read everything.
Whenever I have low blood pressure, my doctor advises me to read the New York Times.
So getting back to the topic at hand, you gave some reasons for why Trump might not want to show the evidence because it might compromise potentially the person that found it, but. Is a congressional committee the right answer? Because ultimately the evidence is either there or it's not there. So if it's going to be found, why not just show it?
Well, this is a representative republic, and we have a certain way of doing things, and I think a congressional investigation is entirely appropriate, as opposed to President Trump just, waging a Twitter war to make his point. And I'm not saying he shouldn't use Twitter. I love his Twitter feed. He needs it to supplement his to amplify his bully pulpit. But this is the kind of thing that is appropriate for a congressional investigation, so we can get to the bottom of this. There are so many moving parts to this story that they really, it might even justify an independent commission, a blue ribbon commission. Though often those things don't really get much done. But it needs to be looked at by our lawmakers, by our policymakers.
Well, I'll
Would you agree with that, Dr. Allen?
Here's the thing. This is part of a strategy to occupy, among other things, to occupy the Trump administration and tie it down. I went through this with Newt Gingrich in the 1990s. Newt Gingrich led an effort by the Republicans to take over Congress for the first time in 40 years. They immediately, the Democrats, led by David Bonnier, who was the Democratic whip in Congress.
From Michigan.
Yes. They immediately began an effort to file one ethics charge after another against Newt Gingrich, many of which were silly or they were technical violations. There was a rule against using your campaign funds to help support your office. Now, Newt was doing that because it was the first transition between parties in 40 years, and there were no funds really to handle it, so he used campaign funds. To make it clear, he used his personal campaign funds to help his office, not the other way around, and yet they made it sound like that was the bad way instead of the good way in order to make him look bad. And eventually, David Bonnier alone filed 75 ethics charges against Newt, of which he was immediately cleared of 74 and eventually cleared of the final one involving the IRS, and he was cleared. But the point was to tie him down, and he actually paid a sort of fine to get rid of that last charge, which he later turned out to be innocent of, in order to get it off his plate, because he would have done nothing but respond to those charges. And I think that's part of the strategy here, is to keep making these accusations, tie Trump people down. Instead of doing the things that they need to do in the government, they will be responding to inquiries, testifying under oath, and so on.
Putting out fires.
Putting out fires. You have to go back to the root of all of this. And the root of all of these stories, this Russia thing, is that this is my theory, but I think it's plausible.
Oh my God, is it a conspiracy theory?
Yes, actually. And it's the kind of conspiracy that happens every day in every political campaign. There's a thing called opposition research where you're going after the other guy. And if you're unscrupulous, which, believe it or not, a lot of political campaigns are, in fact, unscrupulous, then you make stuff up. And in this case, it was people associated with one of his Republican rivals, probably Jeb Bush. These are people from the Lee Atwater, Karl Rove school of politics, which is where if you can find something that makes somebody look bad, whether it's true doesn't really matter that much. And they came up with this thing that Trump was tied to Russia. Now, they came up with it because Trump was saying maybe we shouldn't go to war with Putin. And he was saying maybe NATO should fulfill its obligations and the countries should fulfill the promises they've made to help support their shared defense. So they decided, we're going to make Trump into a tool of the Russians. So they started these rumors, and they kept them going. And the people who were behind it, there's some former intelligence operatives who had been hired. They then went to work for the Democrats once the Bush people were out of the way, and they kept spreading the story. And then here's how it works.
And Steve, I do just think it's important to clarify for the listeners who might not fully understand this story. The reason that Trump would have been wiretapped, that they're saying, is because of these supposed Russian links that they would have been investigating, correct?
Yeah, and what you do is you do like was done against various conservative and libertarian groups in the 1990s. We found out at one point that the IRS had been investigating conservative and libertarian groups almost exclusively over the liberal or progressive groups in terms of people's tax exemptions and so forth. And we
You're
said,
talking about the Lois Lerner scandal.
well, but no, this goes back to the 90s. And what we and when we confronted them on it, their excuse was, well, those are the accusations that have been made. We're only following up on what's in the news media, reports in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and so on. Well, the reason those stories were in there was because they were planted by the people on the other side. So it was a convenient excuse for investigators to, and in some cases sincerely, where there's smoke, there's fire. If there was an article in the Washington Post that said the Heritage Foundation or the Cato Institute wasn't spending its money properly, well, that would get investigated. Whereas there were no stories in the Washington Post or the New York Times or about liberal groups. And so that was the excuse. In this case, you have a fake story that's put out there. It's circulated. It ends up in quasi-intelligence documents. And then the law enforcement agencies, they kind of have to respond, Oh my gosh, there are all these stories about Trump people flying to Prague to meet with the Russian controllers that were running the campaign behind the scenes. And Trump was being blackmailed because, he brought in prostitutes while he was staying in a... This is the actual theory, by the way, for anyone who hasn't heard this, that Trump stayed...
You're talking about Pissgate.
Yes, Trump stayed at the Ritz-Carlton in Moscow.
I love, that's a good gate.
And it turned out the Obamas had stayed there. So he's so insane that he hired prostitutes. Of course, I guess he trusted them not to tell what was happening. And he didn't realize that the hotel suite was bugged, like every hotel suite in Moscow is bugged.
Nobody's more trustworthy than a Muscovite hooker.
Yes, exactly. And he brings them in and he has the prostitutes use, I'm sorry for the details, but people have to understand how ridiculous this is. And that is that the prostitutes used the bathroom on the bed, and then this was recorded, and then this was used to blackmail Trump and all of his campaign operatives into serving the Russians. And this is the story now that our intelligence agencies, well, they just felt like they had to mention in reports that were conveniently leaked by the Obama people, including the last minute change that was done by the Obama people so that information on the investigation into Trump would be included in stuff that was sent to 16 intelligence agencies and to possibly our foreign friends, so that somebody would leak it, and there would be no way really to trace down who leaked it.
You said leak. That's a pun.
Yeah,
and I do think it's just really important to make clear that in this 36-page dossier with all of these wild claims that we're discussing here, even 95+% of the organizations reporting on this, they keep reporting on it and they keep saying, and no evidence has been found.
And I think it was BuzzFeed, which is little more than a gossip site run by former Politico writer Ben Smith led the way in that regard.
Well, except that what they say isn't that no evidence has been found. When they say that at all, and I was watching the Today Show just today before this broadcast, and they mentioned the Russia connection and didn't have any kind of clarification or anything like that. But when they mention the fact that the evidence hasn't surfaced, what they say is, well, there's no evidence yet. And then they emphasize how, well, we must have an investigation. Goodness sakes, how could anyone be against an investigation of these claims? We have to have one to find out whether they might be true that Donald Trump is a Russian spy.
And I don't necessarily think there's anything wrong with doing a lot of investigations. Investigate whatever you want, but at a certain point, when there's just really no evidence for this, and it's just purely allegations, you're starting to use these investigations as a political tool.
As a witch hunt.
Yeah, where it's just exactly what you were saying earlier, where if they can constantly keep him on the defensive, even when there's nothing valid to be defensive about, it doesn't exactly put you in a very fair political situation where you can go out and, start talking about all the things that you're trying to do and all the good things that you're trying to accomplish. You just have to spend all of your time defending yourself. And once you're in that position, of course, there's going to be a share of the population that believes it. And so that's why this is such a, utilized political tactic.
Didn't somebody call this the politics of personal destruction?
Yes, that was what what Hillary, I believe. Was it Hillary that actually coined that term, or was it Bill? I'm trying to remember now.
I thought she invented the concept.
Yeah, I think
and
the concept
it very, very
concept,
well. She
yeah.
was quite an operator.
But nonetheless, these are really major allegations to make against a previous president. And
let me add one thing.
You're saying that the allegation that President Obama led the orchestrated the wiretapping.
If I can say one thing before we get to that, and that is you said there's no evidence. In fact, the evidence is on the other side, which is that, for example, James Clapper, who was the director of national intelligence under Obama, who has been a fierce critic of Donald Trump. And he said, no, he didn't know of anything supporting this Trump-Russia connection theory. And since we know that, at least according to all the news reports, that there were these intercepts, we know from the fact that General Flynn's conversation was revealed, for example, with the Russian ambassador, or at least part of it was, and he was identified, which was illegal, by the way, to identify an American citizen in such a situation. We can be pretty sure that this has been, in fact, thoroughly investigated. And if there were any connections that could be found, there's a good chance they would have found them.
Well,
so the evidence is on the other side.
That's a good segue because, you just said something positive about, trusting James Clapper. But on these wiretap allegations, he's saying there's nothing here. And FBI Director James Comey is saying the same thing and asked the Justice Department to reject these claims. So,
well, we heard a report that Comey had said that, and it's interesting that he hasn't actually come out and said anything directly. And there may be a reason for that. It may be that his comments are very limited in scope. The same thing with Clapper. General Clapper was talking about the things that were basically under his jurisdiction. Well, of course, an FBI investigation would not be under the jurisdiction of the Director of National Intelligence. And various people have been
Clapper as well might be telling the truth. Perhaps he didn't want to know.
Yeah,
so he wasn't briefed on.
There are various
schematics
schematics that people can find online where folks have gone through all the comments made by Clapper and Comey and Trump and said, here are the ways that all three of them could have been both accurate and telling the truth. So when you're talking about FISA warrants...
Right, but that doesn't mean that the warrant wasn't granted.
Right, or that the president...
It is a secret court, after all.
Or that the president didn't essentially go on his own. And I know all the commentary that's been out there about FISA and what you have to do to get a FISA warrant. First of all, FISA warrants, that's the foreign...
Right.
Foreign intelligence surveillance. Those warrants are, they're not easy to get, but they're easy to get rejected for. And the report is that the first effort to go after Trump's associates was in fact rejected. Well, of the 33,000...
Back in the summer.
Yeah. Of the 33,600 FISA applications up through 2013, 11 were rejected. That's not 11,000, 11 out of 33,600. And according to the Electronic Privacy Information Center, no applications were rejected in 2014 or 2015. So it's one of those things where the fact that it was rejected shows you, the first time around, shows you there was probably something wrong with it. And you don't need that much. I mean, it's one of those things, the old expression about how a prosecutor can get a ham sandwich indicted by a grand jury. It's almost that kind of situation here.
They are saying, though, certainly we can't say that these aren't like big, major allegations. If indeed this is true, that Obama himself ordered this, this is Watergate level stuff. I mean, I
think it's beyond Watergate.
Yeah, I think everybody broadly agrees on the severity of this, if it is true. But, Ben Rhodes, the spokesman for Obama, says, no president can even order a wiretap. And another spokesman, Kevin Lewis, said, quote, a cardinal rule of the Obama administration was that no White House official ever interfered with any independent investigation led by the Department of Justice. Why can't we trust this?
But this is a red herring. This is misdirection. The White House isn't involved in these kinds of wiretaps. So, of course, he could say that and say that truthfully. This sort of thing is handled through the Office of the Attorney General. In fact, there's a federal law, isn't there, Dr. Allen, saying that specifically the president is to direct these requests through the Attorney General. And in fact, I don't even think that, according to federal law, that he's required in all cases to seek a warrant. They can just engage in surveillance on the president's initiative. So it's actually a little bit confusing why a warrant was even granted, if one was granted, as has been reported.
Well, you have several different tracks going in here. This would have been Loretta Lynch, who, remember, met with Bill Clinton on the tarmac in the famous meeting while they were considering what to do about Hillary Clinton.
You mean to talk about their grandchildren?
Yeah, that's right. They were just talking about that. Yeah, that's right. That's why you meet with somebody on the tarmac and try to make sure nobody knows about it. And remember, this is the Obama administration that had the IRS go after the president's opponents. At the time, we commented that the most serious charge of impeachment against Richard Nixon, the one that most likely would have brought him down had he not resigned ahead of time, was that he attempted to use the IRS to go after his political opponents, that he attempted, and unsuccessfully. In this case, it was successful. It had a major effect on putting down the Tea Party movement, that you had the IRS going after these Tea Party groups. And we know that was true in the Obama administration, that Lois Lerner, of course, took the fifth, or tried to take the fifth, and she was allowed to pretend she had actually successfully taken it. And there were computers that were smashed and sent off to the garbage dump and all sorts of things in order to cover it up.
Amazingly, by the way, IRS Chief John Koskinen is still in place. Even now in the Trump, 50 days or so into the Trump administration, which really confuses me.
Well, it's part of the fact that you can't staff an administration overnight. And before, we've always had patriotic Americans who were willing to accommodate the new administration, whether you were talking about the Bush to Obama transition or the Clinton to Bush transition and going on back, even when there was a change of parties. Now you have people basically operating as a kind of shadow government openly. I mean, there's stories every day of some department in the government where the people in the department are revolting, and it's exactly what you would expect when you look at the State Department. 99% of the contributions from people at the State Department went to Hillary, 99.4% in the Labor Department, 98% in the Justice Department, and so on. These are not people that like Donald Trump, and they do not support his policies, and they're throwing themselves in front of his policies, and they're not supposed to do that. We're supposed to have an elected government, not bureaucrats who nobody knows their name, and that's causing problems. And that's one of the reasons you have these leaks. The conversation with the Australian Prime Minister, with the President of Mexico, there's no reason those things should have been put out there to the public. And these were, the president's private conversations, and they were leaked out by somebody.
And, I'm sure these leaks are something that we'll be talking about more in depth another week. Just to inform our listeners, this is a major issue right now that, is being referred to as the deep state, which is, appointees from previous administrations who are entrenched in their roles and, may not agree with the policy platform or whatever of a new administration.
Particularly in this case with reference to the intelligence community and the national security community.
Yes, precisely. And, can use the power and access that they have to coordinate with the media and other organizations that are public facing to, fight the administration.
This is also the what did President Eisenhower call it in his farewell address? The military-industrial complex.
And
this is roughly the same thing.
And the scientific technological elite. He warned about the entrenched bases for power in Washington, D.C.
And I have a feeling we're going to get very in-depth on that on an episode one of these upcoming weeks very soon. So with all that said, I think that's all the questions that I had for you guys. Is there anything else you want to talk about in regards to these wiretaps that you think the listeners ought to know?
Well, I think the important thing is to go back to the beginning of the story. Because if you go back to the beginning of the story with the rumors about Donald Trump, you see how, frankly, absurd they are, how there's no basis for this. The fact that people say something over and over, or that it becomes a sketch on Saturday Night Live, does not make something real. And yet that's what we're spending all our time investigating, and all these people want to investigate. And that's what led probably to these wiretaps, is that pattern of spreading rumors about Donald Trump, which was done by his Republican and Democrat political opponents.
And don't forget, as you discovered, Dr. Allen, that the idea that then candidate Donald Trump last year asked Russia to hack the Hillary Clinton campaign is never something that Donald Trump actually said. There was a question planted the seeds of that big lie, and that was by Katie Tur of NBC, who asked a loaded question, saying, that included that assumption, and it spread like wildfire after that. I remember when we were in Philly at the Motel 6 or wherever they stuck us,
covering the
Democratic National Convention, and yet even now. Lots of conservative journalists will say, he asked Russia to hack.
Yeah, the never-Trumpers were big on that.
He never did that. He just said, if Russia, hey Russia, he was being facetious, I thought at the time. Hey Russia, if you have these stolen emails from Hillary, you should cough them up because we'd like to look at them.
Yeah, and there are people who say...
Not the same as encouraging them to hack.
He was joking about the media. He said, well, I'm sure the media would appreciate it if you release these, meaning that the media wouldn't do any such thing. And by the way, people say, well, he shouldn't be joking about a serious thing. If you take him entirely seriously, he was talking about the Russians returning stolen property they'd already stolen. Remember, these were the emails that Hillary claimed she had destroyed and that the Hillary campaign said had no national security information. And yet her people then went on to say that this could be hacked. Well, it could only be hacked if they still existed, meaning she was lying. And they could only, and they said that these contain national security information, which would be true only if, again, Hillary was lying. So her own people were suggesting, in order for the story to hold together, that Hillary must have been lying. Of course, it's comical because Donald Trump never called on the Russians to hack into the American computer systems, and yet that was reported. I think it's something like 50 news organizations reported that we were able to track down. And if anybody wants the big story on this, I have an article on the website that I wrote back at the time. And
at capitalresearch.org.
Capitalresearch.org. And also there's a story that you, Matthew, did based on the Katie Tur element of it.
All right. Well, that's our show for this week. We'll be back next week. We hope you'll join us. If you're not already, please subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or Stitcher, and follow us on social media at the Capital Research Center on Facebook and YouTube. and at Capital Research on Twitter. I'm Jake Klein.
I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen.
And I'm Matthew Vadum.
Thanks for listening.